You ever look at someone, I mean really look at them, and convince yourself you know exactly who they are, down to the cheap shoes they're wearing and the way they hold their coffee cup, only to find out later that you were staring at a reflection in a funhouse mirror the whole time? That was me with Elias. I was the queen of assumptions, the CEO of I Know Better, sitting high up in my glass tower while he was down in the basement checking the fuse boxes. And honestly, if I'd known the truth about the man I was legally married to, I probably wouldn't have spent 3 years treating him like a piece of furniture. I was too embarrassed to put out on the curb. My name is Veronica Vance, and at 26, I was running Vance Aerotech, a legacy aviation firm in Chicago that my father built from a garage shop into a monster that swallowed government contracts for breakfast. But while the business magazines called me a prodigy, the truth was I was just a kid in a tailored suit trying to keep the sharks from smelling the blood in the water. My father, the great William Vance, died of a sudden stroke, leaving me with 2 things: a controlling share in a company filled with old men who wanted me gone, and a husband named Elias Thorne, a man my father had practically forced on me in his final days like some sort of grim inheritance, whispering about a debt of honor and safety while I just nodded, thinking the morphine was talking. For 3 years, Elias was a ghost in my life, a man who worked the graveyard shift in facilities management at my own building, basically a glorified janitor with a security badge. And we lived this bizarre, bifurcated existence where we shared a legal document, but I stayed in my penthouse, overlooking the river, and he lived in some rat hole apartment in the South Side that I'd never even visited. I was ashamed of him, I'll admit it. I was ashamed that the heiress to an empire was married to a guy who scrubbed scuff marks off the lobby floor, so I kept it buried. A secret so deep that even my assistant didn't know, and whenever I saw him in the hallways, pushing his cart or checking a door handle, I'd look right through him like he was made of glass, never seeing the way his eyes tracked everything: the exits, the cameras, the threats, because to me, he was just the price I paid to keep my father's lawyers happy. It all changed on a Tuesday in November, the kind of Chicago night where the wind feels like it's trying to peel the skin off your face, freezing rain turning the asphalt into black ice, and I had just wrapped up a 14-hour day fighting with the board of directors, who were pushing for a merger I didn't want. I took the private elevator down to the executive garage, completely drained, my head pounding with the rhythm of a migraine, and as the doors slid open, I remember thinking it was too quiet. Usually the echo of the ventilation fans was loud, but tonight it was dead silence, and before I could even reach for my keys, a black van screeched around the pillar, blocking my path, and 3 guys spilled out, moving with that terrifying speed that tells you this isn't a mugging, it's an extraction. They were pros, masked up, tactical gear, zip ties already out, and I didn't even have time to scream before a bag was shoved over my head, and I was thrown into the back of that van like a sack of laundry, the smell of gasoline and stale sweat filling my nose as panic, cold and sharp, finally set in. I don't know how long we drove, maybe an hour, maybe 2, every bump in the road feeling like a hammer to my ribs, until finally we stopped, and they dragged me out, the cold air hitting me again, and I could hear the distinct sound of industrial machinery in the distance. We were in the Rust Belt, probably one of the abandoned mills near Gary. They tied me to a chair in the center of a massive, hollow warehouse, the kind with skylights blackened by decades of soot, and ripped the hood off, revealing 3 men who looked less like criminals and more like private military contractors. Dead eyes, expensive boots, weapons that looked illegal in 3 different states. The leader, a guy with a scar running through his eyebrow, was talking on a satellite phone, saying something about the package is secured and transfer the funds. And I realized with a sick sinking feeling that this wasn't about ransom money, this was corporate sabotage. Someone wanted me out of the way so the merger could go through, and I was just a loose end that needed tying. I was shivering, not just from the cold but from the absolute certainty that I wasn't walking out of there. And I closed my eyes, wishing I'd answered my mom's call that morning, wishing I hadn't been so cold to everyone, wishing I'd actually lived a life instead of just managing a portfolio. And then, purely by chance, I heard a sound, so faint it shouldn't have been audible over the wind rattling the corrugated metal roof. It was a click, the softest engagement of metal on metal, coming from the catwalks high above us. And before the leader could even turn his head, the lights in the warehouse exploded, plunging us into total darkness, and the air suddenly felt different, charged, heavy with a presence that hadn't been there a second ago. Chaos erupted. The men were shouting, turning on their flashlights, beams cutting through the dust, screaming contact, contact. But they were shooting at shadows because the threat wasn't where they looked, it was everywhere. I saw a silhouette drop from the rafters, silent as a spider, landing behind the guy guarding the door, and there was a sickening crack, precise and efficient, and the guard folded like a cheap card table without making a sound. The other two spun around, firing blindly, the muzzle flashes lighting up the room like a strobe light in a nightmare. And in those flashes, I saw him, Elias, but it wasn't the Elias I knew. It wasn't the guy who wore a gray uniform and looked at the floor when I walked by. This was a monster, a kinetic blur of violence, who moved with a fluidity that was terrifying to watch. He disarmed the second guy in a motion so fast my eyes couldn't track it, using the man's own momentum to slam him into a concrete pillar, and then he was on the leader, the guy with the scar, who managed to pull a knife, but Elias didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He just stepped inside the guard, deflected the blade, and delivered a strike to the throat that dropped the man instantly. The whole fight lasting maybe 12 seconds, and then there was silence again, just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the rain drumming on the roof. He walked over to me, stepping over the bodies like they were puddles, and pulled a knife, not a weapon, but a utility tool, and cut my zip ties, his hands steady, warm, and utterly familiar. He pulled the mask off his face, and there he was, Elias Thorne, looking at me with those same calm, brown eyes. Only now I noticed the intensity behind them, the predator lurking just beneath the surface. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice flat, professional, scanning me for injuries like I was an asset rather than his wife, and I just stared at him, my mouth opening and closing like a fish, because my brain couldn't reconcile the janitor with the John Wick character standing in front of me. "You," I stammered, rubbing my raw wrists, you killed them. They're not dead," he said, sheathing the knife, "just incapacitated. Though the big one is going to have a headache for a month. We need to move. Veronica, there's a second team 5 minutes out." And he grabbed my hand, not asking, just taking charge, and pulled me toward the exit, his grip iron tight. And for the first time in my life, I didn't pull away, I didn't assert my authority. I just followed the janitor, because he was clearly the only person who knew how to keep me alive at the ride. Back to the city was surreal. Elias hotwired a sedan parked outside the warehouse, because of course he knew how to do that. And he drove with one hand on the wheel, and eyes constantly checking the mirrors, taking a route I didn't recognize, weaving through back alleys and service roads to avoid cameras. I sat in the passenger seat, the adrenaline fading into shock, looking at his profile, the sharp jawline I'd ignored, the scar on his neck I'd never asked about, and finally, the anger started to bubble up through the fear, the indignation that I had been kept in the dark, that I had been played for a fool. "Pull over," I said, my voice shaking. "Not safe yet," he replied, not even looking at me. I said, "Pull over." "Damn it," I screamed, slamming my hand on the dashboard. And surprisingly, he listened, swerving into an empty gas station lot under a flickering light, the engine idling as he turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Who are you?" I demanded, tears stinging my eyes. "Because you sure as hell aren't a facilities manager, and don't you dare lie to me, Elias. Not after tonight." He sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest, and for a second, the soldier vanished, and he just looked tired, infinitely older than his 36 years. "I'm exactly who your father hired me to be, Veronica, the insurance policy." "My father hired a janitor," I spat back. "Your father hired a ghost," he corrected, his voice dropping an octave. "I was with the 24th Special Tactics Squadron before. I moved to off-the-books intelligence work. Your dad was my handler back in the day, before he went corporate, and when he got sick, he knew the sharks were coming for you. He knew you weren't ready for the kind of war that was about to start. So he asked me to watch over you. By mopping floors, I asked, incredulous. By being invisible, he said. Nobody looks at the janitor, Veronica. Nobody worries about the guy changing the light bulbs. But the guy changing the light bulbs hears everything, sees everything, knows which board members are selling secrets to the Chinese, and which mercenaries are being hired to snatch the CEO. I've stopped 3 attempts on your life. In the last 2 years, you just never knew about them because I handled it before it got to you. 3 attempts. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I thought I was running the show, but I was just a child playing in a sandbox while he was standing guard at the gate with a rifle. Take me to your place, I said quietly. I can't go back to the penthouse. They'll expect me there. He hesitated, looking at me like he wanted to argue. But then he nodded and put the car in gear, driving us to the south side, to a neighborhood where the streetlights were broken and the buildings had bars on the windows. His apartment building was a brick walk up that smelled of boiled cabbage and old cigarettes, and we walked up 3 flights of stairs in silence, me in my ruined designer suit and him in his dark tactical gear that he'd somehow hidden under a WINDBREAKER. When he unlocked the door to apartment for B, I expected squalor. I expected beer cans and pizza boxes, the stereotypical bachelor pad of a guy making minimum wage. But what I walked into was a shock to the system that almost floored me as much as the kidnapping had. The place was spotless, almost sterile, like a monk's cell, with hardwood floors that gleamed and walls lined with books, not paperbacks, but heavy, leather-bound volumes on philosophy, military history, engineering, and classics in languages I couldn't read. Make yourself comfortable, he said, moving to a small kitchenette to boil water. I have a med kit. I need to check your wrists. I wandered around the room while he busied himself, feeling like an intruder in a stranger's life, and my eyes landed on a wooden chest at the foot of his perfectly made bed. It was old, battered oak, with a heavy padlock that was currently unlatched. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew it was an invasion of privacy. But after tonight, privacy felt like a luxury neither of us could afford. So I knelt down and flipped the lid open. Inside, it wasn't just memories. It was a whole other life. There were photos, black and white and grainy, showing a younger Elias in desserts I couldn't name, standing with men whose faces were blurred out, holding rifles, looking exhausted but alive. There was a folded American flag, the kind they give you at funerals, and underneath it, a velvet case containing a silver star and a purple heart, medals that people die for, tossed in a box like spare change. But what stopped my heart was a yellowed newspaper clipping at the very bottom. Dated 20 years ago, the headline read, "Local boy pulls family from lake house inferno." And there was a picture of a 16-year-old boy, face soot-stained, carrying a terrified 6-year-old girl out of a burning cabin. I stared at the girl in the photo, the wide, terrified eyes, the clutching hands, and I realized with a jolt of electricity that went straight to my marrow. That girl was me. I remembered the fire at our summer lake house. I remembered the heat, the smoke, the feeling of being trapped, and I remembered strong arms lifting me up, a voice telling me to hold on. My father had always told me the firefighters saved us. He never mentioned a boy. He never mentioned him. "You," I whispered, holding up the clipping as Elias walked back into the room with a steaming mug and a first aid kit. "It was you." He stopped, setting the mug down on a coaster, his face unreadable. "It was a long time ago, Veronica. Why didn't you tell me?" I stood up, the clipping shaking in my hand. "My father made me marry you. He made me think it was some financial debt, some business deal gone wrong. But it was this. You saved my life when I was 6, and you saved it tonight. And for 3 years I've treated you like dirt. I didn't do it for the gratitude," he said, walking over and gently taking the clipping from my hand, placing it back in the box. "And your father didn't make you marry me because of the fire. He made you marry me because he knew I was the only person in the world who would never, ever let anything happen to you, because I'd already invested everything in keeping you alive." "That's not an answer, Elias," I shouted, the emotion finally spilling over. "Why let me treat you that way? Why let me look down on you? Do you have any idea how guilty I feel right now? I wouldn't even introduce you to my friends." He looked at me, and for the first time, a crack appeared in the armor. A flash of pain that was so raw it hurt to look at. Because I deserved it. He said softly, "After Kandahar, after the things I had to do, living in that apartment with Elias was like learning to breathe underwater, disorienting at first. And then suddenly, it was the only way I could survive. For the next 2 weeks, the CEO of Vance Aerotech vanished from the social register. I ran the company remotely from a laptop on a second-hand kitchen table while Elias, my husband, my bodyguard, my roommate, slept on the couch with a Glock within arm's reach, refusing to take the bed no matter how much I argued. It was intimate, in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. I watched him clean his weapons with the same meticulous care he used to make coffee. I listened to him murmur in his sleep when the nightmares of the dessert caught up to him. And slowly, the shame I felt about him transformed into a burning, white-hot rage at myself and at the people who had forced us into these corners. We fell into a routine. I'd work on tracing the financial trail of the mercenaries, and he'd work his contacts, meeting shady characters in diners at 3 a.m., bringing back intel piece by piece. We discovered that the hostile takeover wasn't just corporate maneuvering. It was orchestrated by my father's old partner, Marcus Sterling, a man I had called Uncle Marcus since I was a toddler, the man who sat at the head of the board and smiled at me while plotting to sell off the company's tech to foreign bidders and leave me as the scapegoat. He's going to announce the sale at the shareholder meeting on Friday, I said one evening, staring at the encrypted files Elias had retrieved from a server farm in Jersey. He's going to say I'm incompetent, unstable, missing in action, and he'll force the vote. Elias was sharpening a knife, a rhythmic shk sound that used to scare me, but now I found weirdly comforting. So we stop him. He said simply, "I can't just walk in there," I sighed, rubbing my temples. "They have security, his security, and without proof that links him directly to the kidnapping, which we don't have hard evidence of yet. It's my word against his, and he's a beloved industry titan, and I'm the hysterical daughter." Elias stopped sharpening. He looked up, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face, the first time I'd ever seen him smile like that. "Veronica, you're playing by the rules of the boardroom," he said, standing up and walking over to where I sat. "But Marcus Sterling didn't play by the rules when he sent a hit squad to grab you. He changed the game. So we stop playing chess and we start playing war. And how do we do that?" I asked, feeling a shiver that was half fear, half excitement. "We walk in the front door," he said, "but this time I'm not wearing the janitor's uniform." The morning of the shareholder meeting, the atmosphere at the Vance Aerotech headquarters was electric, the lobby packed with press, the board members circling like vultures in expensive suits. Marcus Sterling was at the podium, looking grave and concerned, spinning a narrative about my unfortunate mental breakdown and how, for the good of the company, he was stepping in to finalize the merger. I was watching on a live stream from the back of a tinted SUV, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Ready?" Elias asked from the driver's seat. I looked at him. He had shaved. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that we'd bought the day before. It cost more than his car, and he looked devastating. He didn't look like a guard. He looked like a king, radiating a quiet, lethal power that made the air around him feel heavier. "Ready," I breathed. We didn't sneak in. We walked right through the main entrance, Elias moving beside me not as a subordinate, but as a partner. The security guards Marcus's hired muscle stepped forward to block us, and I saw the moment of recognition in their eyes when they looked at Elias. A flicker of primal fear, because real predators recognize each other. Elias didn't even have to touch them. He just gave a subtle head shake, a look that said, "Try it and you die," and they stepped aside. Parting like the Red Sea. We burst into the auditorium just as Marcus was calling for the vote. The double doors slammed open, echoing through the silent hall, and every head turned. Cameras flashed, whispers erupted, and Marcus froze mid-sentence, his face draining of color. "I apologize for the tardiness," I announced, my voice amplified by the microphone Elias handed me as we walked down the center aisle. "But I was detained. It takes a while to wash off the duct tape residue from a kidnapping attempt." Gasps rippled through the room. Marcus recovered quickly, gripping the podium. "Veronica, my dear, you're clearly unwell. This is exactly the kind of erratic behavior we were worried about. Security, please escort Ms. Vance to a quiet room." Two large men moved from the side of the stage, but Elias stepped up onto the platform, placing himself between me and the threat. He didn't take a fighting stance. He just stood there, adjusting his cufflinks, and spoke into the lapel mic. "Rigged up, I wouldn't do that," he said, his voice booming through the speakers. "Calm and terrifying. Unless you want me to read the transaction logs from the Cayman accounts that paid for the team in Gary last week. Or maybe we should talk about the encrypted comms on Mr. Sterling's phone," Marcus sputtered. "Who is this man? A bodyguard? A hired thug?" I stepped up next to Elias, taking his hand publicly, proudly lacing my fingers through his. "This isn't a thug, Marcus. This is my husband, and he's the head of my new internal security division." Effectively immediately, the murmurs turned into a roar. The press was going crazy. I looked out at the sea of faces, the people who had doubted me, the people who had ignored Elias, and I felt a surge of power I had never known before. Mr. Sterling orchestrated an abduction to facilitate a sale that lines his pockets and guts this company, I declared, holding up the flash drive Elias had prepared. "We have the bank transfers, the phone logs, and the testimony of the surviving mercenary who decided he'd rather talk to the FBI than deal with my husband again." Marcus looked at Elias, then at the drive, and realized he was checkmated. He slumped, the arrogant facade crumbling, and as the police whom Elias had called an hour ago entered from the back, the room erupted into chaos. But I stood still, anchored by the hand holding mine. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was nuclear. Marcus went to federal prison, half the board was fired, and Vance Aerotech was dragged through the mud before we could start cleaning it off. But the biggest story wasn't the corporate espionage, it was us. The Cinderella reversed story, the CEO and the janitor, it was everywhere. But here's the thing about happy endings, they're usually just stopping points. Before the real work begins, we didn't ride off into the sunset. We had to rebuild. Elias struggled with the spotlight. He hated the interviews, hated being called a hero. The PTSD didn't magically go away just because he put on a suit. There were nights I'd find him sitting on the balcony at 4 a.m., staring at the city lights, shaking from adrenaline that had nowhere to go. And I had to learn how to be a wife to a man who had seen the worst of humanity, how to navigate the fact that my entire safety net had been built on his suffering. We made a controversial choice a year later. I sold the majority stake in Vance Aerotech. The business world called me crazy, said I was throwing away my legacy, but I didn't care. We took the money, billions of it, and we started a new firm, Vance Thorn Solutions. But not for aerospace. We focused on veteran rehabilitation and high-level security consulting for whistleblowers, people who needed protection from the sharks. We moved out of the penthouse, but we didn't stay in the apartment either. We bought a ranch in Montana, somewhere quiet, somewhere with wide sightlines where Elias didn't feel hemmed in. He runs the training programs, teaching young guys that strength isn't about how many people you can hurt, but how many you can save. I run the business side, but I do it from a home office with a view of the mountains, wearing jeans instead of Chanel. Sometimes, people ask me if I regret the way it started. They ask if I feel guilty about the years I spent looking down on him, and I tell them, every single day. But guilt is a useless emotion unless you use it as fuel to be better. The world loves a hero, but they usually treat the people who actually do the saving like they're disposable. We walk past them in the hallways. We ignore the guys fixing the roads, the women cleaning the offices, assuming that our degree or our bank account makes us superior. But let me tell you, when the lights go out and the monsters come, you realize pretty quick that the person who can save you usually isn't the one sitting at the head of the table. So, I have to ask you guys something, and be honest in the comments, because this is something Elias and I still argue about over whiskey by the fire. Was my father right? Was it moral for him to trap Elias in a life of servitude, to force a marriage just to protect me? Using a traumatized soldier as a human shield for his daughter? Or was it the ultimate act of love? Elias says he'd do it again, in a heartbeat, that the mission was worth it. But me? I look at the scars on his back and the nights he can't sleep, and I wonder if the price of my safety was too high. What do you think? Does the end justify the means, or did we just get lucky that we found? Love in the wreckage. Let me know what you think. I'm Veronica Vance, and thanks for listening to our story.